If you went to Sunday school, you might think the Book of Ruth is the Bible's guide to dating. But the truth is, that only works if you're into farmers only. Let's find out what it really says. Welcome to the first episode of the 2x2 show. This is something I've been waiting for a really long time, and I'm so humbled and honored that you decided to join me today. Now, our goal here is to help people understand the Bible on a deeper level and help them see how much connectivity there is between the entire book of Scripture. And I think the perfect place to start is the Book of Ruth. So sometimes in the church, we often keep Ruth as kind of the romantic love story of the Bible. It's also often taught as this massive rags to riches Cinderella story. And those are both very true. That happens for the people in the story. However, I think there's a lot more that we can learn. Now, today, I actually want to just stay within the first 5 verses of the book. A lot of times when we're reading a Bible story, we kind of take that context, that beginning part of things, almost as a once upon a time idea. And we do that a lot with the Book of Ruth. Now, Ruth is a very short book, and it's in the middle of these big epic tales of battles and conquering and foreign armies. So sometimes it feels like this sweet little break from reality. And I think that's why a lot of the time we cheapen these first 5 verses. So let's get started with chapter 1, verse 1, and see what we're working with. Okay, I'm going to read these first 5 verses to you now. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The names of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, this is like very depressing piece of scripture. In 5 verses, everybody dies. And so you might be wondering why we're dedicating our first an entire episode to these 5 verses. Here's the thing. Let's look at verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled. Those are the very first words of the book. And again, if we're not careful, it kind of sounds like once upon a time or in a galaxy far, far away. But no, in the days when the judges ruled. Now, the Book of Ruth, that tells us is happening in the time period of Israelite history that is Judges. Judges is also a book in the Bible. So it's both a time period, a snapshot in history, and a book dedicated to that time period. So what's interesting about Ruth is that although it's a separate work and it's a separate piece of literature, it falls up under the Judges umbrella. Now, Judges is not a great time to be alive. It's after Israel has come into the promised land. And now what happens is they were given the command to kill everyone in the land because then the Lord would fulfill the promise that it would be theirs, right? Well, as per usual, they don't completely follow through. And what happens is they're left in this time period of Judges where they are still having to battle all of these now enemy neighbors. And over time, we have 12 individuals rise up into power, and they help the Israelites from enemy rule and defeat. But ultimately, every time, Israel is unable to keep their covenant. It's a very violent book. It's a very sad book. And a lot of the times, people joke that they don't want to preach Judges because it's just not a good time. It's really hard to make sense of. So we need to kind of ground our minds to the fact that Ruth is happening in that mess of human history. Okay, the next piece of verse 1. There was a famine in the land. This is another little light bulb moment for you and I. Now, by the time we get to Ruth, we are just getting into the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. We're not too far into history here, although we have covered a significant amount of time. We're really not too far into human history. So let's pair that with this concept of famine. Per scripture, and our understanding, this is only the fourth famine mentioned so far. The other three are in Genesis. Got one with Abraham, one with Isaac, and one with Joseph. Now, famine is a little confusing. For you and I today, we have no American concept of famine. We have never once understood that, you and I, as contemporary Westerners living in one of the wealthiest places on planet Earth. It is something to be considered normal or usual in other places of the world, especially across history. One of the best things I've heard was from one of my professors, and they said, you will know Israel standing with the Lord based on the fruitfulness of the land. So if we are looking at this time period of Judges, which is awful, and we're already seeing Israel's inability to uphold their side of the covenant and remain faithful to God and his law, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a famine. But the broken relationship is evident in the creation they've been given. Okay, now the other thing is, let's look at famine in relation to individuals. Like I said, Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph. I'll just cut right to the chase. Famine never ends well. Because the thing is, now, you're like, duh, there's no food. That's not what I mean. What I mean is famine tends to be, up until this point included, a driving force for travel with those three men and their families. So there's a famine in the land and Abraham goes to Egypt. There's a famine in the land and Isaac leaves as well. There's a famine in the land and Joseph ends up, long story short, reconnecting with his brothers, but he's in Egypt, right? And so it's always pushing people out of the promised land and into danger and into harm's way. Now, that does not excuse the actions of those people, but there is a connection there. For example, Abraham has received the call, he's received the covenant that Canaan is going to be the land of his descendants and the evidence of his covenant with Yahweh. There's a famine, he hightails it to Egypt, and he lies about the fact that Sarah is his wife and things don't go well. The exact same thing happens to Isaac. He decides to hide his wife and things don't go well. Joseph, although sold into slavery and leaves the promised land under different contexts, there's a lot of death and a lot of destruction and a lot of hardship in Joseph's life. And after all of Israel moves to Egypt, after this kind of family reunification, all of Israel ends up in slavery in Goshen. So famine is not great. We already know that we are in this time period of Judges, and that should be a red flag. On top of that, we see this driving force of famine. Okay. Now, let's look at the next part. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Okay, a little geography lesson for you. When Israel, they were still kind of measuring and tracing themselves as a tribal people and looking at bloodlines based off of the 12 sons of Jacob, they divided the land by tribe. Judah, let's consider Judah like a province or like a state. And so Bethlehem is a city within Judah, the southern part of the promised land. Okay. Moab is outside of the promised land. It is foreign. It is across the Jordan River and across the Dead Sea, not a part of the covenant land given to Israel by God. Okay. Now, a few other things. Moab is, although neighboring, one of the most hated enemies of Israel. Moab has its roots in Genesis 19 when Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, there's some incest, and then the firstborn son of the incest is named Moab. And so all the descendants of that line become Moabites, are from Moab, and those very difficult beginnings of the people remain evident in the relationship between Israel and Moab. So here we are, a man and a family under the covenant of God. They're living in the promised land. It's supposed to be the land of milk and honey. In the time of Judges, things go wrong. This covenant is not being upheld. The creation shows it, and they hightail it not to another province, not to somewhere a little friendlier, but to Moab. Like the worst direction they could go. as far as a political and kind of international relational standpoint goes. Now, let's take a step back to Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the word Bethlehem, the title Bethlehem means house of bread. So what I want you to see here is the irony that happened both, I believe, historically as God is the author, but also the irony that the divinely inspired biblical author is sure to point out to us. It's the time of Judges. Things are not right. There's a famine in the house of bread. Okay? Things are not right. And rather than standing within the covenant, Elimelech runs. And he runs to enemy territory, just like those who came before him. And as we continue on, it doesn't go well, right? And this time it actually leads to death. Now, we can read this a few ways. You can say, everybody dies. That's what happened. Who knows if there was a famine in Moab as well? Sure. Absolutely. It's not that he died because he left the promised land. But from a literary standpoint, Bethlehem means house of bread. There's a famine in Bethlehem. Elimelech, the name Elimelech, means my God is king. And so where is his faithfulness to the covenant here? And I think that you and I forget that we're under the same covenant. We're not living in the promised land. We're not living in the land of milk and honey, although quite frankly, America is very fruitful. But we are living in a covenant with a God who promises to be our provider as long as we continue to uphold him as God is king. And I shouldn't say as long as, he's not contextual, but our portion of the covenant is to uphold him as God is king. And at the first sign of trouble, and I'm not making light of famine or the need to feed a family, but he hightails it to enemy territory, looking to be his own provision. I think this speaks volumes for you and I. We are not an agrarian society, you and I. We are not farmers. I do not need to harvest my own dinner or seasonal income, thank God. But I do wake up every day thinking I need to provide for myself, and thinking that I need to build a life in which what I need and what I want is created out of my own effort. And he has never been that God that requires that of us. He has constantly, before and after the story of Ruth, been the ultimate provider. What comes to mind is manna in the desert. He's just asking us to uphold the concept that he is king, no matter the season, no matter the context. Because I think that the unending work that is required to be our own provider only leads to death. We end up exhausted, we end up empty, and you and I can spend our lives working. And there's nothing wrong with work, don't get me wrong, we were created to work. But we were not created to toil, and those are two different things. And how quickly we are and become addicted to the toil rather than working in the peace of the promise of Yahweh. Okay, now a few other things I want to add in here. Names are a huge deal in the book of Ruth. So we started with Bethlehem, the house of bread. We started with Elimelech, my God is king. His wife Naomi means sweet and pleasant. I want you to remember that for a few episodes from now, because this girl makes a turn. Mahlon and Chilion, this is kind of their only moment in scripture. Their names are sick and dying. Ha, yikes. What's cool about the Israelite and the Jewish history and culture is that names mean something. And when we see children named in scripture, it is a promise, a moment in faith that will happen for that child. What's weird here is that we've got these children with negative names. And so what we could discuss is, were those really their names? Was that something that the author added in later? Is that something, what mother names her child sick and dying? I don't know. But in the episodes to come, we're going to see a little bit of a shift in Naomi's character and Naomi's ability to uphold the concept that my God is king. I love the Book of Ruth, but quite frankly, I think it should really be called the Book of Naomi. Orpah means back of neck. Remember that for a few episodes from now. And Ruth means friendly and companion. So right off the bat, we are seeing here that there is some favor for the women, sweet and pleasant, friendly companion versus sick and dying, but even back of neck. Something I want you to think about too is that Ruth and Orpah are Moabite wives. This is a big no-no for this point in scripture. It is taught up and down, left, right, and center not to marry foreign wives. And we have countless stories leading up to this book that prove why, and an inability to keep the covenant. And kind of being I shouldn't say gateway drug, but like a gateway drug for a breaking of covenant within entire households and men who were once leaders in the faith. And so what's interesting here is that Elimelech, my God is king, has moved his family out of the promised land, out of the covenant, and now they're taking Moabite wives. None of this looks great. But these Moabite wives in this book are given Hebrew names. I don't have the answer to this, but it's something I want you to know. I want you to be a responsible reader of scripture that can start to piece together the contextual flags and lights so that you have a better understanding of this book. A lot of times when Ruth is taught, this part is skimmed right over because it's not fun. It's not cute. Boaz isn't on the scene yet. Nobody's dating. It drives me nuts a little bit because Ruth is often taught at like mega church Christian dating conferences and is used as like a argument for courting. And there's a great relationship between Ruth and Boaz, but no, there's so much more to this. I will not let us water it down in that way. Okay, so this is what I need you to see in the first 5 verses. Elimelech's family's a mess. He's decided to see himself as provider numero uno, and he's brought other people along with him. And so I challenge you, when you wake up tomorrow, when you get to work today, as you continue to, even if it's errands, I don't know what, but if you continue to be the provider of your own needs, whether they're emotional, financial, energy, whatever it is, you're going to end up sick and dying in enemy territory. And I know that sounds aggressive and a little turn or burn, but it's a quiet and slippery slope. And our call is that even in the famine, even when we've messed up and we're not upholding our side of the covenant, that we remain under his portion of the promise in faith. And that is where we will find him and we will find provision. Because the truth is, the famine didn't last forever. We have the rest of the Bible to go. It's not like the world wiped out because of this famine. I don't mean to make light of any need, but if we take a step back from a macro standpoint, that's exactly what's going on here. So, first episode is done. I'm so excited. I love Ruth. It only gets better from here. I hope this was encouraging to you. I hope this opened your eyes a little bit. I want you to shake off your previous understanding of Ruth. Those things are good, but I'm telling you, there's more. It's a very, very fun book, and I think it's a great place to start. So, if you liked this video, I would like for you to share it with your friends, your family. I want to hear what you think. I want to hear what they think. This might be new to you. If you are on Facebook, share. If you are on YouTube, subscribe. Here we go. I can't believe we're doing it. It's going to be great. Thanks for watching The 2x2 Show.